Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I am Dr. Brad Reedy, and today is Monday, August 23rd, 2021. For those of you that might be newer to our format, every other broadcast that we have is a live question and answer. So the questions that we collect from the previous webinar or broadcast, the questions that we collect throughout the week, you can always write questions, suggestions, requests to webinar@evoketherapy.com. And then, of course, any live questions you submit this evening throughout the broadcast. Those will go into my moderator, who is Sarah this evening, moderating for me this evening, and then she'll pass them on to us, all of us, anonymously, and I'll read them and do my best to answer the questions. So it looks like we have in the queue 5 or 6 questions before we get to any live questions. And the first one reads, can you please tell us how you handle some of the extreme weather, storms and fires happening in Utah? You know, in southern Utah, actually where I live in northern Utah, the smoke has been incredibly horrible, but it hasn't been that difficult out in the wilderness, comparatively speaking. So what we do is we monitor the air quality all day, every day. And only one time in our 23-year history have we ever had to evacuate the kids from the field due to fire, really due to air quality. And that was actually, I think, 2 years ago in our Oregon program when there were wildfires all over Oregon. And they had to be taken out of the field for about 2 days. And we rented a bunch of Airbnbs and housed them there for a couple of days. But that's an exception and the only time that it's ever happened. We've had to move 1 or 2 groups when there was a fire close enough that we didn't want to get to an emergency point over the years. But for the most part, the backup system is incredibly complex, and we have protocols for everything, for snow, for blizzards, for road damage, for floods, for heat, for cold weather. So they're always monitoring that in our backup central hub. And then they're communicating with the groups twice a week via satellite phone or two-way radio just to get a report about how everybody's doing. And then they can call in at any time. So it's all regulated very, very carefully. And in fact, more than you could regulate your child's life, more than my life gets regulated in terms of safety. There was a research study done many years ago in our field that said that a child is 7 times more likely to require emergency medical services, like from an ER, when they are at home as compared to being in a wilderness therapy program. So while, of course, it's difficult and it's a raw experience, physical safety is, of course, the paramount job responsibility for our field guides, for our field staff. So all of that gets handled really well. Somebody writes, I'm trying to sort out how to be present with my child's depression. I know about some things I shouldn't do, but I'm less clear about what I should do. And Sarah, you can also type that on the public so they can see the questions too. I'm going to read it again. I'm trying to sort out how to be present with my child's depression. I know about some things I shouldn't do, but I'm less clear about what I should do. Gosh, working with depression can, for me, I don't think this is true of all therapists, but for me, be one of the most challenging circumstances to deal with somebody they love. You know, maybe because of what I personally went through over the past couple of years with the pandemic, I can be a little bit quieter with somebody who's depressed. I can slow down my pace when somebody's depressed. You know, a couple of thoughts. As with all diagnoses, all messages to your children, and this, what I'm about to teach and reteach, really applies to all of you in all of your relationships. So it's not just for depressed folks, but of course it applies there too. Think of the nervous system as kind of the perimeter guards of a castle in the medieval world, right? Looking over, making sure the drawbridge is closed and guarded, right? Maybe even some advanced scouts out there, making sure that there are no encroaching armies ready to attack the castle. So the nervous system serves that purpose, to protect us, from perceived threats or real threats. And so, whenever you're trying to get into the city, you have to relax the guard, right? You have to let the nervous system experience that there is no threat. So, moving slow, moving quietly, not having too much of an agenda, not trying too early, too much fix it energy is really important. People could tell you can read workbooks on depression and read things about cognitive behavioral therapy and thinking errors. And yes, those are what depression is about in many ways. But the problem with depression is everything that would make it better if the person did it, that they feel unmotivated to do those things. Talk to people, talk to somebody who can help you, go to meetings, go to a session, exercise, even sleep, right? Healthy food, lower your self-medicating behaviors. Everything I've just listed, the person who's experiencing depression is unmotivated to do. So, having said that, what can you do? Not be a threat, not push too hard, not try to take control. Those are the things that you said. You probably know those things because those are the things not to do. Um, the way out of depression often is, gosh, this is a really hard thing to explain using words, but you're trying to find where the energy is and why it's buried. It could be as simple as poor self-care. When I struggled mildly with depression over the past 18 months with the pandemic, I was still functional, still did my job, but I was definitely less motivated than I was pre-pandemic, and that I feel now that we're coming out of the pandemic. At least I'm traveling, exercising, doing more things. But so it can be as simple as poor self-care. I think about mental health and mood disorders simply sometimes with my clients as the amount of energy in versus the amount of energy out. If you're giving more than you're receiving, you're going to end up depleted. But some parts of depression, there's a damned if you do and damned if you don't kind of experience for the person experiencing depression. In other words, if I express my authentic truth, I'm going to be punished. But at the same time, if I repress my authentic truth, then I'm going to experience depression. So sometimes the way out of it is kind of an irreverent escape. Oftentimes I'll explore anger, explore feelings that they think they shouldn't feel or have because it's not acceptable in their culture or in their family. I remember one time I had a student and I really joined with his anger. He was suffering from depression and suicidality. And I really joined with the underlying anger that I could feel in our session. May have even joined a little bit too much because the next letter to his parents was a really angry letter. But he did say something powerful to them. He said, I don't know if I want you in my life anymore, but I'm not suicidal. And of course, that's not an easy letter for a parent to get. We've kind of moved from the frying pan to another frying pan, so to speak. But what I explained to them is that's a good sign. That's a way out of the prison. Sometimes let's hear his anger. Let's give it some space. Let it breathe a little bit. So you're trying to find out where the authentic self is. And I think about that in therapy a lot. Where's the authentic self? I pay attention to should and shouldn't energy. I was out in the field last week and one of the clients had broken a rule and was being asked to be accountable for it. But I could also tell that it weighed on him in such a profound way, kind of like a temporary, momentary depression, eyes down, low energy, stumbling to say the right thing to make the authority figures happy. And I wanted to release some of that pressure. And so I called the client by name and I said, you know what? I don't know how we're ever going to forgive you for what you did. And his face lit up because he knew I was being silly and funny about it. His face lit up. He sat up a little bit straighter. He looked at me and he said, "Thank you." And he could breathe, right? There were other examples that week where I'm just looking for the authentic self. I've shared this with you all on these broadcasts before, but when somebody says to me in a session, when they say, "I know I shouldn't feel this way or think this thing, or I know it's wrong, or I know it's unenlightened, or I know it's just a defense," I know that the next thing I'm going to hear about is going to be the authentic self, the self that they're not supposed to be, the self that they've been told who they're not. So you kind of got to patiently dig around and expose what is buried and why it was buried. The problem with depression, first of all, I'll talk about the chemical nature of it in just a second, because that deserves time. But if you bury, let's just use your sexual orientation as an example, because that's not an uncommon one at all. Let's say you identify or have feelings of same-sex attraction, gay, homosexual, and your context or your family, or you feel like that won't be accepted. So you bury that. You push it down. The problem with pushing down that truth is it takes with it lots of other things. Lots of energy, so to speak. So you might push away grief because you lost a parent. Push it down. You don't want to feel the pain. Makes sense that we don't want to feel it, but the problem is that it takes a lot of energy with it. If you place a dam on a river, you can't simply block out the bad water, right? The poisoned water. You block out all the water. That's kind of like depression. The solution to keep the water smooth, to not get in trouble, to not provoke the authority figures, to not get rejected, all that energy, that should and shouldn't energy, pushing down on us, takes with it all the energy. Now, there are chemical components, right, that can be triggered by beliefs, situations, circumstances, events, and so forth, but they have a mind of their own, no pun intended, right? They act independently, and so a lack of free floating serotonin is going to be a part of people's depression, right? If you have low dopamine output, you're going to not feel a sense of well-being, a sense of joy, a sense of exhilaration in life. So there are, of course, it's much, much more complex than just those two things. But treating it chemically can jumpstart you. I always talk about with depression, medication is getting you in the starting gate. If you can't get in the starting gate, then medication would maybe a great idea. So it's tough. It takes a lot of patience. As always, folks, as always, make sure that you are doing your own work, because somebody with depression gives so little. They have so little to give. And so if you go into a conversation or a relationship hoping for at least 30% back, I'll go 70% of the way, but meet me the 30%, it might be beyond their capability or their motivation, their ability to summon up that kind of energy. So as is always the case, but maybe more specifically in this case, make sure you're taking care of yourself somewhere else with somebody else, so that you're available in those conversations and in that relationship to the other person. Somebody writes, "I'm trying to sort out how to be present with my child's depression." I think that's the same one. My son, who is 15, at Evoke for 107 days. He is now at a therapeutic boarding school. He's been there for a little over 5 months. He's stuck. He's not made much progress at all. He's still lying, bullying, hanging out with bad influences. We have been doing our work every day. We are in a much better place finding ourselves. Great. However, it is still hard to see that he is not making progress. Part of us wants to send him back to a voc. We let him know that we love him, support him, and mostly then we zip it. It's his process, but he can't live at a therapeutic boarding school. Your thoughts on how we might regroup and continue to move forward? It's a really, really great question. And you know, obviously, I don't know the answer specifically, but sometimes revisiting wilderness can be helpful. I was probably one of the wilderness therapists who had that happen fewer than others because I just wanted to be careful. It's an expensive program. So I was always reluctant to think of that as a first option. But if you have resources, it can be, at worst, it can be an assessment. You know, if he doesn't regain that wilderness kind of growth mindset that you saw, I didn't mean growth mindset, I meant growth or mindset. Um, then you get an assessment of it, right? Um, yeah, it sounds like you're doing all that you need to do. I hope you have a consultant and a therapeutic boarding school consult or a therapist that you trust, because ask them hard questions, you know, and listen to their answers. I believe this in my heart. You know, I give you guys a hard time. I give you parents a hard time. I talk about you doing your work all the time. I talk about how you always dent your children. You can't escape that. I'm sufficiently hard on you. But at the same time, I also feel very, very protective of you. You're in a very vulnerable position as a consumer of very expensive services. And you deserve to ask hard questions and you deserve intelligent answers. And you deserve to have that be not just a one-time thing, but a constant dialogue. If you feel shamed or shut down or judged, you're too needy. This is an evidence of your anxiety disorder or your codependency. There may be some truth to those things, right? But to be dismissed for wanting to understand a story where my son's stuckness at a therapeutic boarding school makes sense in the treatment plan and the diagnoses, that's not evidence of a problem. That's just a concerned, interested, invested parent. So I hope you have a consultant. I hope you have a boarding school therapist that you respect and that you feel that cares about you too. And then ask tough questions and hard questions. Think outside of the box. And if resources aren't too limiting, I know wilderness therapy is expensive. I know it as a consumer as well as a business owner. It could give you at least some insight into what's going on, even if it doesn't shift things back the way that it was. I'm sorry. In these kinds of situations, I can't do this because of my time, but I want to get on the phone with you. I want to get on the phone with therapeutic boarding school consultant, or excuse me, therapeutic boarding school therapist. I want to hear the story, hear how the child is doing, and kind of help you to brainstorm this. That's why having a consultant can be so important to facilitate that. Thank you. I wish I could give you more. Somebody writes, my son was recommended to have relational therapy as opposed to behavioral therapy. In the past, he has expectations at home and consequences could be natural and some were positive things earned as well as negative consequences. If he attends a relational type boarding school, what will be different as far as the consequences for not following house rules after he comes home? I'm asking because I've read reviews online where some parents say kids get to do whatever they want at a relational school. I listened to your webinar comparing behavioral versus relational therapy, and I thought you were saying that they both have positives and negatives to them, and both might be necessary to support kids. Absolutely. A couple of things. It's about emphasis, and it would be a mistake for a program to be all relational or all behavioral, for sure. I think it'd be a mistake to have a behavioral program without even a significant relational component. This is very important, especially in light of what I was talking about earlier with therapy or healing being part of finding the authentic self, the authentic truth that's buried deep inside somebody who's suffering, for example, from depression. Who it also gets buried behind anger and substance abuse and anxiety and other things too. So, um, having said that, we don't want to reduce children or anybody, you, me, we don't want to reduce people to good and bad behaviors. We have to get beyond that. That doesn't mean that systems won't have accountability and won't have natural logical consequences. That could be a part of it. But if that becomes the priority, you'll notice in the chapter in the journey of the heroic parent, the chapter, each of my chapters have a little epigraph, a quote. And in that quote, and in the first paragraph, I say something along the lines of, before rushing in to try to change a behavior, it would be important to understand what that behavior is trying to tell us. So you always want a relational component. I really frankly don't know of programs that are too relational or relational to a point where they're not holding them accountable or they can just do anything. I've really never heard that complaint before in 25 years. Not from a parent, not from a professional. I've heard an example here or there where people wished a program or two was maybe tougher in one or two ways, but I've never heard. I think this is my best guess. I think what the people that are recommending this to you are trying to do is get you to think in a relational way and to not have a school that is very simple and two-dimensional. Behavioral schools can be good for certain diagnoses. They can. But like I said earlier, even with those, I would still want relational aspects. But I've never heard of something being too relational. I really haven't, ever. And I remember there was a another wilderness program a few years ago when they were presenting and they were kind of the hot new one on the block, and they were talking about how they don't have levels and how they don't have reward systems. And then they gave example after example after example where they praised their clients or gave them these little symbolic gifts that they would make. And I raised my hand and said, that's a behavioral reinforcement schedule. You're adding to it some really important elements, but don't teach a non-behavioral model. I use behaviorism in therapy, and I'm the least behavioral person I know, but I still, when you say something to me that's honest or courageous, I'm going to acknowledge that and praise that, the courage that it took to say that, right? If you describe a dilemma of yourself with clarity, I'm going to praise that, say that's a really clear and articulate. I spend a lot of time in my sessions praising, and praising is a behavioral reinforcer, period, full stop. So just speaking theoretically, because that's all I can do. I can't make specific recommendations on these broadcasts about specific schools or specific students, clients. I will tell you, I don't have a concern that a program is too relational. Now, it might be a level of care and supervision that's a lot lower than is appropriate for your son. Like, if he were at a halfway house or a sober house and was working on the community, that's for a young adult specifically. But just using that example, that might be too much freedom versus maybe what we would call extended care or a therapeutic program or a treatment program where there's more accountability, more supervision, more structure. But I wouldn't worry about it too much. Relational is good, and they'll have behavioral. And we don't want to. I think it's more dangerous. It's really close. It's not like 80-20, but it's probably like 55% more dangerous for something to be too behavioral, in my just simple opinion, versus too relational. I'm less worried about that in general. Somebody writes, my child feels shame because she knows we are worried for her and love her, but she says she is being authentic by acting out with risky behaviors. How do we find a balance of keeping her safe, but also letting her be her authentic self that is dangerous to herself and others? Well, punching somebody in the nose is not authentic, right? It's not. That's not what we mean. Most of all, I would just listen to her. And what you just shared with me, I would just listen and hear. This is an important parenting point. I don't know how well I'm going to be able to articulate this because it's so nuanced. The stuff that I teach, I've said this before, but the stuff that I teach, it's not that you take what I say and you say it back to your children. It is to inform you. You take back what I've taught with a new level of awareness, with a new perspective, a new overall conceptualization, and then you act based on that knowledge. So 98% of the stuff that I talk to you guys about on these broadcasts aren't for you to repeat to anybody, ever. Unless you're trying to teach somebody the same thing that I'm teaching. But not to the identified patient, not to the child, not to your spouse, your co-parent, if it's about them. It's to help you understand them. And then by understanding them, you have compassion. And there's truth in what your daughter is saying, but there's also ignorance and a lack of insight in what she's saying. You know, stealing, cheating, hitting, hurting yourself, hurting others, driving drunk. Those don't just get put under the category of being authentic. I suppose at the end of the day, the place that you can hide in, if you will, that you can rest in, maybe is a better phrase, is your boundaries are your boundaries. I was just teaching the staff a couple of weeks ago. It's almost like you're apologizing for the fact that the boundaries have to exist because this is kind of the way that we have to do it because if we're all yelling and screaming and going crazy, it's just too hard. So you almost sympathize with them when you're setting the boundary, always listening, always trying to understand, always trying to have empathy, which is, in a way, the term psychologically is containing or holding space for them. So she'll figure it out. Acting out is not just authenticity. In fact, in a very clear way, it's inauthentic. You can Google this right now. You know, pull up a new window on your screen and Google this quote by Carl Jung, right? Freud's student, where he said that neuroses or mental health symptoms is a substitute form of legitimate suffering. So he's saying it's kind of going out the back door or the side door, right? It's leaking. It's manifesting itself in symptoms. Underneath that, there is authentic, genuine feeling and suffering. But my hurt and my punching you in the nose is not the same thing. My sadness and fear and my screaming and calling you names are not the same thing. My sadness and fear is authentic. My screaming is and yelling and calling you names is just my behavior. So most importantly, try to detach as much judgment and rightness. Separate that out from the boundaries. The boundaries are in place because they're your boundaries and you get to have them. And your lack of judgment, you know, the lack of emotional energy you put into the the behavior that she's doing. That's where the space for her to be herself comes in. But it's not. It's a logical fallacy to conflate accountability with compassion. You can be completely accountable or require accountability and also be compassionate. We don't do it very well, I admit. We don't usually only really get make people accountable in our lives when we get really upset, really angry, really scared. So that's part of our work, right? Is to take care of the distress, as I always say, over here in this Al-Anon meeting or this therapy session or this parent support group, take care of myself over there emotionally so that when I come back to the child, my decision will be grounded and rooted in practicality and in a healthy sense of self for me and my boundaries. I hope that helps. Somebody says, please describe the earth, fire, water, and air phases and what is their purpose? What do they signify? It's a very loose program to take you through just adjusting. The earth phase is adjusting, right? Kind of basic compliance with safety needs. Fire is a dynamic process. Most students and clients spend most of their time in the fire phase, and some never move past it. You know, you're starting to be accountable, but you're also starting to experiment. Prochaska's model of change. You know, you're moving past pre-contemplation, and you're starting to consider things. You're trying things on for size. Water phase, there's some kind of internalization of it, right? You're not just doing it to comply, but you're doing it because it feels better. So integrity and integration. And then air phase is about leadership and future focus. It's not important that they get all the way through it. We've specifically designed a program where many, if not most of the students wouldn't get all the way through it because we don't want people to hear that you're done. You know, being done with your work at any age is a disaster. You know, if I read this the other day, somebody wrote, if I believe the same things in 20 years from now as I believe today about life, I've wasted 20 years of my life. Think about yourself 20 years ago and what you've learned about life. So the phases are loose and they're just to encourage kind of behaviorally, symbolically, ritualistically, because we have different rituals for each one of them, reinforce the growth and the progress through it. And again, we don't want to place judgment on it. We want it to be a descriptive process. You're in that dynamic fire phase where you're still figuring it out. You're still working on accountability, or you're on the air phase where I can see it's starting to rest inside of you. The change, the growth, the life is starting to. I can tell that you can taste the sweetness of the therapeutic principles. I'm just going to go on a tangent for a second about therapy. Therapy is work. It is. You all know, if you've been listening at all, if you've heard any of these, because I mentioned it probably a ridiculous amount of times, but I've been with my current therapist for 22 years. It's the easiest hour of my week. It's the best hour of my week. I'm never late to it because it's the 1 hour that I get to be me and I get to be loved and seen and understood. Yes, sometimes I have to feel grief. I have to work through shame and guilt. I have to work through resentment, frustration. Yes, I express and feel all of those things and bring them to therapy and set them metaphorically on the therapist's table for them to look through and help me make sense out of. But therapy, I tell this to our students, it's not just, when I was younger, especially in wilderness therapy, people used to say, and I used to be complicit in this idea, they would say, well, my son or my daughter's mad at you, and that means you must be doing your job. And that happens for sure. But after a while, especially when you get along with the phases, that's probably why I was thinking of this. It often feels good and great because, again, in my opinion, therapy is the one place, 1 hour a week where you can't make a mistake because the job is to help them become who they are. And even when they have their defenses up, you understand the defenses in the context of their life, their sense of fear and anxiety or threat, their trauma, their wounds. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but I wanted to share it. Somebody says, new in the program, understanding that all kids and situations are different. What do you, 20 plus years of outcome data, tell us about what typical happens next? What percent go home and what go to boarding school? About 2/3 go to some other kind of residential program after wilderness. And that can, in summertime, it drops down to maybe 60%, and maybe in the winter it goes up to 70%. But about 2/3. And what I always tell people when I get asked this question, which is one of the top 10 questions I've been asked in my career about going home versus not going home, is when I started as a wilderness therapist in 1996, when I started, my bias was that kids should go home, especially if they worked their butt off here. It was amazing. I couldn't believe the progress that students, back then it was just adolescents, that they made in 8 weeks, give or take. But after about 6 or 8 months, I started to see how difficult it was. And really how small of a container or a box wilderness therapy is, for better and for worse. There's obviously limited rules and freedoms, and that's a challenge for everybody. But the therapeutic support, the container, the fact that in a lot of ways you're insulated. This is important. You're insulated from their daily ups and downs, from their arguments. You know, when parents are choosing a more liberal program afterwards, I point out to them, you're choosing to do more work. Great. But just know, this program over here that's more conservative, rules wise, contact with family, home visits, so forth, community, interaction, that's going to be easier in the short term. Now, if a child clearly needs that level of care, then we're clear to recommend that. But this one over here is more work. You're going to get unsupervised phone calls. Your child's going to complain to you because it's not going to be run through the therapist filter. It's not a bad or a good thing. It's just be aware that there's a difference. So, yeah, we try as much as we can to make recommendations and to walk you through the decision-making process without shame, without pressure, without what I did early in my career. I think try to bully people into the decision that I thought was best for them and their family, and really just kind of guide you and help you draw out where are you at. I told it to the therapist last week in training. Challenge parents why, not what. Don't challenge what they're doing. That's not an important distinction. Challenge why they're doing it. You want to bring your child home? Tell me why. You want your child to go to this program or that program? Tell me why. And see if there's something in there that's missing, which oftentimes we can kind of parse out and deal with. So that's a long answer to a short question. Thank you. My son has been home from wilderness therapy and a residential treatment center. He tends to self-sabotage when he's gaining success. This is just water with that Mio drink in it. It's a strange drink for an adult man to be drinking. My son has been home from wilderness therapy in a residential treatment center. He tends to self-sabotage when he's gaining success and meeting his goals or when he's about to make a positive shift. Can you share your thoughts on this? If that's accurate, and I'll take you at face value, it's shame. I know this sounds insane, But if we could eradicate shame and guilt, it'd be messy for a little while. It'd be a little rough in the early stages. But that's so much of what we're treating in therapy. It really is. When you think of the opposite of shame, I'll just use an example of a human being that I've heard speak, the Dalai Lama. And he's humble, incredibly humble, and playfully self deprecating, constantly self deprecating in a playful way. I believe he's trying to model what I get passionate about every once in a while on these broadcasts, the fundamental task in mental health. You want to know the biggest secret in parenting, in my opinion, and I don't think there's a close second, and it also happens to be the biggest secret in mental health or being a therapist or in a marriage? It's accepting. There's a lot of ways to say this. I'll try to use some words that might fit for you that hopefully some of them could be triggering. But the secret is to accept the fact that you're flawed, imperfect. In the journey of the heroic parent, I have a little section called the idiot parent. Idiot parent. Some people are triggered by that word. The subtitle of my new book is Learning to Love Your Horrible Rotten Self. If you accept that you're a buffoon, that you're a bumbling numbskull, you're free. You're free to set boundaries because you don't need to be right or good anymore. I know it's not intuitive. I know it might not make sense, but if you could accept your whole self, not just the good parts, the pretty parts, the smart parts, the talented parts, the successful parts, but the dirty, ugly parts. If you could embrace them, if you could just hold them, they could heal. And in relationship, the fights you're having most of the time are about trying to prove that you're good. The struggle with boundaries is when people try to talk you out of it, or when you feel bad because you feel like you're abandoning somebody, or you get told that you're being unloving or not compassionate enough, or whatever it is. If you accept your horrible, rotten self, you're free. So if self-sabotage is a part of his cycle, he's struggling with what all of us struggle with, which is shame and guilt. And that's a really, really important, because if he's successful, if he achieves something, there's pressure. He can only go down from there. Pedestals are a horrible place to have to live. And yet we seek for admiration and respect from others in our life. The key to the treatment, people think all the time that self-esteem is an inside job. I've stumbled onto my soapbox, but so be it. People think that self-esteem is an inside job. That's just not true. We know from the science of human behavior that self-esteem comes from somebody seeing you, validating you, comes from another person. Ideally, it would come from your parents and your primary caregiver. That's the ideal. It's called healthy attachment. And it's based first and foremost on the parent or caregiver's sense of self, either because they had a healthy attachment growing up or because they have what we call earned attachment, which means they did enough work in therapy to sort it out. And so the goal in a therapist, the goal in a mentor, the goal in a teacher is not to find somebody who values you because you're smart, clever, pretty, successful, a fast runner, a great dancer, a wonderful singer, great with spreadsheets. The key is to find somebody who values all of you, even the not so pretty parts. Somebody that you can say the most horrible thing about yourself, and they show you love and compassion. It's what the bishop did in the musical Les Mis, Les Miserables, right? It's that moment of grace. It's what, if you haven't seen Hamilton, I just saw Hamilton again this weekend in Los Angeles. It's what Eliza does toward the end of that musical. It changes you. So yeah, he needs to work on shame and guilt like all of us. If we could just discover that we were okay as we are, everything would change and we would heal. And our symptoms, our maladaptive coping mechanisms that hurt us and others, we could look at them without judgment because it wouldn't be a measure of our goodness or our badness, our rightness or our wrongness. That's what Rumi means when he says, there is a land beyond right and wrongdoing. I will meet you there. That's what Khalil Gibran means in The Prophet when he talks about good and evil. And he says, of the good and you I can speak, but not of the evil. And I could go over and over and over again with metaphors and religions and philosophies that teach the same thing over and over again. This is the secret. When I say secret, I'm not talking about some mystical thing. I'm thinking it's the thing that's right out in front of us that we don't see. It's what Mr. Rogers taught. Watch the movies with Tom Hanks and the documentary that came out 3 years ago. It's the same thing over and over and over again. And by the way, one last thing before I get off my soapbox. A person who's capable of the kind of compassion that I'm describing can also have, and to kind of complete this, also has strong and clear and unapologetic and soft, meaning gentle, but firm and clear boundaries. We were taught that to have this mindset, that what the bishop did in Les Mis, if you haven't seen that, watch that, because that's this story. We were taught that the bishop had no boundaries. That's of course not true. We only know him for a moment in the story, but of course he's a man of great strength and integrity. So not only are they not exclusive of each other, compassion and boundaries, but in the deepest sense, both have to be present for them to be authentic, for it to be authentic, for it to be complete. Somebody writes, what would you consider a success in a wilderness program? With that in mind, what is the success rate of programs like this? Sarah, the best thing you could do probably for the research questions is go to the part of our website where it has all of our research, both that we have done internally and that we've had published. Those are very, very succinct. At that page, you can just put that page and give it to the group here. There's no way to answer that question because for some, they make a lot of progress. For some, they make subtle progress. For some, it's just assessment. I suppose in the context of the broadcast this evening, I'll tell you my greatest priority. I have two priorities as a person who runs a wellness program. I have one for the parents and one for the child. And the one for the child is a reduction in shame and guilt where he or she or they feel seen, heard, and understood. I remember when I was leaving my wilderness group for the last time, turning the last few clients over to my colleague. And I said to them, and I didn't know I was going to get emotional. And I said, first of all, I love you guys. It's been my honor to be your therapist. And yeah, you've made tons of mistakes, lots of screw ups, but you're okay. You haven't even made as many as I have just by sheer volume. And I hope that you had at least one moment with me where you felt that from me. That I just loved you and that all of your screw ups and your mistakes and your idiocies were just part of the dilemma of being a human being growing up, because it's hard to be a young person. So if a client can get that, that's an outcome. Have that experience. For a mom and dad, I would say the same thing, but um, for you guys to have hope, for you guys to shift your perspective away from the good and bad behaviors, the right and wrong behaviors, to a mental health perspective where their rebellion or their lying or their stealing or their choices aren't about you. That you can feel by the end of this process freer, loved, respected, cared for. I suppose a very concrete hope that I have for all of you, and I know some of you because I see your names. I click over and look at the list of names sometimes, and I know some of you. I suppose the outcome for everybody is that you'll keep working on yourself for the rest of your life using some of the tools that you had here, meaning therapy or therapeutic support. Because even if you have the best program in the world, meaning you specifically, come to us and have the best 10 weeks in the world for you and for your child, you're never done. So I suppose the outcome is that you felt like therapy was helpful and beneficial, and you had a sense of what good therapy was because you and your child were cared for and loved and not judged, that you were supported and taught, that for the child, shame and guilt diminished, and for the parent, suppose that they were released of the same two things and that they were able to hear and see with greater perspective and clarity, and ultimately that you keep doing your work. That your experience with us wasn't unpleasant or it was pleasant enough that you want to keep seeing somebody like us, even if it's not us. All right, thank you for the link, Sarah. One last question before I wrap up. My daughter's 18, has been to a therapeutic boarding school, wilderness residential treatment center, and a transitional therapeutic boarding school in Massachusetts, and is currently in another RTC in Sacramento. She's expected to return home the next month after completing credits for a diploma, and depending on what the Sacramento court decides on her misdemeanor case for vandalism, she is claiming to have a dependency problem and wanting me to allow her to vape or smoke as a means to relieve her anxiety and anger, and a substitute for smoking weed or doing other drugs, as she expects to be triggered from having to be accountable when she returns home. What course of action should I plan to take? Well, I can't tell you any question about should. You get to decide. I will tell you that, generally speaking, it's not a hill that I think you want to die on for an 18-year-old, especially with all of that treatment, right, that she's carrying around with her. It's really important to find as many rules that aren't fundamental values of yours that you can be flexible or break upon, because there are some that you won't be flexible and you won't break on, and those are very important. So I don't know what you should do. I will tell you that most people will tell you I wouldn't die on that hill. I wouldn't fight that battle too hard. Even in Al-Anon, or excuse me, even in AA or NA, a program committed to sobriety, there's a lot of smoking and a lot of vaping. Now, I don't smoke or vape. I don't like to smoke or vape. I don't want my children to smoke or vape. So I get it. I realize it's a crutch, but it's not the worst crutch. There are worse crutches. And we have to be aware and careful not to pull away all the crutches all the time. So yeah, I you can do what you want. I support you 100%. I don't think I would die on that hill, given what you've told me about your child. Somebody writes, one of the greatest gifts we receive from Evoke is how you normalize the therapy process for us. In our family, my kids ask me how many therapy sessions is weekly. Ask me how my therapy session is weekly. It's so great for us to have this new normal now. I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you. All right, folks. A few things upcoming. The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, my two books, are available on Amazon and Audible. I read The Audacity to Be You. For support groups, the next one for the wilderness is August 26th at 6:30 p.m. So that's later this week, 6:30 p.m. For an intensive family or person. It is September 14th at 6 p.m. And then we're having alumni meetings only now. So alumni meeting tomorrow night, August 24th, 6:30 p.m. You can email malia@evoketherapy.com for more information. My biggest recommendation for parents, individuals, if they can do it, is to do intensive work. I believe in it wholeheartedly. It's changed my life, changed my family's life. My program changed our program. The next Finding You is the next in-person one is September 8th through 12th. We also have an online one that's half the time, half the cost, and then we have an online part 2 later. But it's a great start, much better than I thought it would be online. Returning to You is if you've attended a Finding You or a Finding You 2, we used to call them, then Returning to You is kind of our continuing, if you want to do it. We have one October 6th through 10th. That is one that I will be leading. Intensives at evoketherapy.com for more questions. If you like the approach at Evoke, we have coaches that do virtual coaching all over the country. Just contact Travis at evoketherapy.com. Wilderness therapists, intensive therapists, and so forth. We also have pursuit trips, 3 to 30-day programs for families or young adults. Think Therapy Light or transitioning, coming home in between programs, or to reconnect to your therapy. Therapy Light, customize the design as your family wants it. We ask all current families, parents, to go to 6 12-step support groups. Any combination of Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. You can also go to RefugeRecovery.org or NAMI.org for free classes and resources in your area. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You at Evoke Therapy Podcast. Go there, share, subscribe, listen, download. You can also go to soundcloud.com on your computer and search Finding You. You can find us at Twitter and Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy or at Dr. Brad Reedy. And on Instagram, you can also find at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find Evoke Therapy programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. Of course, our blog has new content each week. The next broadcast will be August 30th, a week from today, getting your child to wilderness using a transport company, which is a very, very, very hot topic these days. Can't wait to talk about it as an intervention, as a starting point. So thank you for joining me this evening. For and on behalf of your family member and those that love you, I will just say this clearly. Thank you for being willing to seek out help, to get help, and to work on yourself. Take care, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.